Firstpost reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alyson Le Grange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global south. Join me every weekday live on Firstpost. Hello and welcome to Firstpost Africa, where we get you the top stories from the continent and from across the world. I'm Alyson Le Grange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa. First, let's take a look at the headlines. Top Democrats back Kamala Harris as Democratic Party nominee, and donations surge as U.S. President Joe Biden withdraws from the 2024 presidential race. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu heads to Washington, D.C., where he will address the U.S. Congress. He says Israel will remain America's strongest ally, regardless of the November outcome. Taiwan carries out anti-landing drills, kickstarting the annual war games of the island, which aim to be as close as possible to actual combat, simulating how to repel a Chinese attack. Bangladesh's student group leading demonstrations against Sheikh Hasina government. The jobs quota suspends protests for 48 hours as the death toll mounts. Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan sacked 2 prominent ministers as part of a major cabinet reshuffle amid reports that they were secretly plotting to challenge her re-election bid. Hello and welcome. We begin with the biggest headline across the world right now. U.S. President Joe Biden has decided to quit the 2024 presidential race. Biden's stunning move has upended the race to the White House. Now endorsements are pouring in swiftly for Kamala Harris, after Biden threw his support behind the current U.S. vice president. The Democrats are yet to put a blue tick to Biden's endorsement of Harris. If they do, the race could likely now be Harris versus Trump. What does this mean for the continent of Africa? How did Joe Biden navigate U.S.-Africa ties? And how could this change if Trump wins the election? Let's understand. America's engagement with Africa is not new. Since President Ronald Reagan, each president has had a signature policy initiative for Africa. But a serious and sustained engagement began under the Clinton administration. President George W. Bush also pushed U.S. development and security aid to Africa. It further deepened with significant bipartisan support under Barack Obama. Trump's election, however, signaled a radical break with this consensus. Then came Joe Biden. Biden said his administration was all in on Africa's future. He aimed at bolstering trade ties with African countries. In 2022, he hosted leaders from 49 African nations for a summit in Washington, D.C., and announced a $55 billion aid for new projects in the continent. But under Biden, America struggled to reassert itself in Africa as Chinese and Russian influence continued to surge. He has drawn attention for not visiting the African continent despite underscoring its importance on global issues. He did, however, send his vice president and top diplomats on multiple visits aimed at a diplomatic upswing. But in the past few years, America's standing in Africa, especially the Sahel, has taken a hit. U.S. military presence and aid failed to stop the spread of coups across a belt. stretching from Guinea in the west to Sudan in the east, all ruled by military juntas now. U.S. efforts to nudge Sudan from military dictatorship to democracy ended in a bloody civil war which is still raging. In Niger, U.S. troops completed a withdrawal from their base in Niamey. The remaining troops will fully depart before a September 15th deadline set by the junta. These military bases provided intelligence in the war against Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have now welcomed Russia as their ally of choice. In Somalia, U.S. troops are still supporting local forces fighting the Al-Shabaab militants. Wars in Ukraine and Gaza have complicated ties between South Africa and America. The Biden administration dismissed South Africa's genocide case against U.S. ally Israel as meritless. Pretoria also refused to criticize Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. At times, African countries have been frustrated with the Biden administration, which they say has been distracted by crises in Afghanistan, Ukraine, and the Middle East. By hosting the Kenyan President William Ruto for a state visit to Washington, President Joe Biden aimed at opening fresh doors of cooperation with Africa. But now Biden is out of the race, and Ruto himself is fighting for his political survival back home. Now, analysts say African leaders must brace themselves for Donald Trump again, who in his previous term had a purely transactional relationship with the continent. He too, like Biden, did not visit Africa during his tenure. Trump centered his Africa policy around countering China. His America First budget had put Africa last, with major cuts to aid. In Africa, Trump's first term is also remembered for his outburst, where he used a verbal abusive slang for some African nations. His Muslim travel ban denied entry to nationals of a number of Muslim-majority countries, including several in Africa. So a return of Trump could mean a reduction in America's involvement in Africa and multilateral issues such as climate change and development aid. While some experts say his return may not be a pleasant news for Africa, others beg to differ. Now, Trump's transactional approach, mirroring that of China's in Africa, could prove comforting for some African leaders who are lectured on democratic backsliding and LGBT rights. Many of them are reluctant to have their governance come under constant scrutiny by the West. Trump, like China and Russia, does not necessarily attach principles of democracy to engagement. However, Trump's return could undermine anti-terror operations in the Horn of Africa. For now, America's political course remains highly uncertain, and how would it steer ties with Africa also remains to be seen. Now, for more on this, we have with us Zemedene Negatu, a geopolitical commentator who is joining us live from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
What is your assessment of the relationship between the U.S. and Africa during Biden's tenure as president since 2020?
Right. So, as you indicated in your intro, there's been, I think, a dramatic shift, at least in tone, compared to the Trump administration. I mean, I'm talking about the Biden administration. Yes, not a whole lot, as expected, was accomplished, but at least there was an effort by President Biden to re-engage with Africa in a meaningful way. I mean, your intro was very detailed. You've covered all the bases. For example, the U.S.-Africa summit a little over a year ago. I mean, I was there. The atmosphere was very positive. Some meaningful, some steps were taken. For example, a lot of cabinet members, including Vice President Kamala Harris and others, came to the continent. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen came. So a lot of high-profile people came. But to be very frank, in terms of substance, nothing hugely or transformational has happened in the last 3.5 years. I think President Biden was intending to come, but obviously because of other issues that you mentioned, he was not able. But at least the tone and the goodwill was there. And unfortunately, I think if Biden and if Trump wins, I would see a reversal of even that positive momentum. So a lot needs to be done. The
Right.
50 billion plus, or actually it was 70 billion that was committed during the U.S. Africa summit, yet to show substance or meaningful way in Africa. That needs to start coming down. But I think part of the challenge for the U.S. is it doesn't have the institutional structure to compete with the likes of China, or even now an ascending India and others. The U.S., what it expects its private sector to come and invest, but U.S. private sector cannot compete with sovereign wealth that comes from China, for example. So I think there needs to be a complete rethinking. Whoever comes in, I think hopefully it will be Kamala Harris. If it's the Democrats, I think the re-engagement will continue, but I'm afraid if it's President Trump, which is now an inward-looking isolationist policies, is documented in their policy, even this last week at the Republican National Convention, they've stated that. I think there'll be a reversal or even downgrading of Africa's importance in the White House and in Washington.
Right. Yeah, on that, let's dig a little bit deeper. The US has been in the past committed to partnering with Africa on various fronts, including economic development, trade, as well as peace, security, democracy, human rights, and opportunities for the youth. If Trump wins another term as president, what impact do you think this will then have on US-Africa ties?
So listen, the most important thing in Africa today is development, economic development. You cannot separate the other things you mentioned, democracy and other things, from economic development. So if the United States focuses almost exclusively, as it has been doing for a number of years, on these other things, to the exclusion of economic development, to the exclusion of ramping up Africa's youth to engage in jobs that are meaningful, then the other things, they will not resonate that well with Africans. So I think that the two needs to go together. As I said earlier, though, the US is not in a position to provide billions of dollars that is needed for investments, not aid. Aid, yes, has a role, but the focus still continues to be in the United States, security, aid, and that kind of stuff, as opposed to coming in with FDI, for example. There's relative, compared to the size of the United States economy, American FDI in Africa is very small. So for Africans to be receptive to what the US is trying to promote, the democracy, human rights, and other things, it also needs to see a meaningful engagement on the economy. Let me give you a very good example. US-Africa trade, the last data I had was less than $70 billion. US-China trade topped $200 billion. You see, so these are the kinds of disparities that the US needs to fix if it wants to have a receptive audience. Even with, as I said, with the goodwill that the Biden administration has, all the intentions, if it goes back to Trump, even that goodwill will be gone. And I don't think, I mean, he was very clear in his first term, he didn't really want to engage with Africa, regardless, whatever it is. Even the transactional description, I don't think is very accurate, because if it was always, Africa was an afterthought, okay? So my concern is even that little, re-engagement that was started under the Biden administration probably will go by the wayside, and on an occasional here and there kind of thing, but that is not going to do the U.S. Here's the problem the U.S. is facing. For example, today, 3 African countries have joined the BRICS: South Africa, India, and Ethiopia, and more are going to be applying. The BRICS, if you look at the growth, where the growth of the global economy is going to be in the future, the BRICS is a good indicator where everybody wants to light it. The global South wants to be engaged via the BRICS. As you know, India and China and South Africa and Russia, these are the anchors. We've now added a number of countries. Now it's 10. The rumors will be up to 20. But the U.S. has nothing to counter that. So I think this is where the challenge is for the United States. It's not just, you can talk about human rights, you can talk about democracy. Somebody once told me you can't need democracy. I completely agree. It needs to be parallel to economic development, investments, and the U.S. can afford it. I mean, we saw that during the COVID crisis. They printed $6 trillion when it's needed. So it's not for lack of money. I think they just need to rejig the institutional infrastructure of the United States, the mindset. Let me give you a final thought. There's a forecast from Goldman Sachs, the big Wall Street investment bank, which says over the next 40 years or so, the 25 largest economies in the world. Of those 25, 3 are in Africa. 3, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And there are many others just below that coming from Africa. So the US, as I said, has to understand the future is heading east. I always said there's a gradual shift of economic power from west to east. And I don't think a lot of people in Washington either don't get it or they're not yet alarmed enough to be engaged with Africa. The youthful population of Africa, the growth, all the natural, the mineral resources today, our powers, our cell phones, our cars, all come from Africa. So the US doesn't seem to be in an alarm mode why it's being disengaging from Africa.
Right. And just quickly, finally, considering Russian and Chinese interest in countries in Africa, how will the geopolitical situation be affected depending on who is elected in November in the US?
Well, listen, China is already heavily engaged in Africa. I think it will continue to do that. Russia in a slightly different mode. I mean, it has a lot of economic engagement, but mostly in other areas. But it's a member of the BRICS, so I think it will continue to be actively engaged in Africa. Geopolitics, good point. Let me give you an idea. If you look at just the Horn of Africa, Eastern Africa, 10% of global oil passes through that little narrow strait. 10%. And as you know, at the moment, for example, with the Houthis and the uncertainty in that part of the world, a lot of economic disruptions have happened, right? So geopolitics is very important. So the Chinese are engaged, the Russians are engaged, India is now heavily engaged or starting to engage, and the Brazilians as well. President Lula of Brazil was in Ethiopia, spoke at the African Union, visited Ethiopia. So a lot of these either emerging countries or the ones that have already emerged, like China and India, have heavily engaged Africa. So geopolitics, and now, of course, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and in particular the UAE also are playing a very significant role. So the U.S. seems to be ceding this very strategically important part of the world, maybe without thinking about it, because they're engaged, their minds are in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and other places, and Africa seems to be on the bottom of the shelf. That is not, I don't think that's a prudent way for the U.S., the world's largest economy, the world's probably only superpower, to be disengaged from Africa. And I think so geopolitics will continue to play a role, and it's better for the U.S. to wake up quickly.
Right. Thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa and for your valued insights and analysis there.
Thank you for having me.
Shifting focus to Kenya, as anti-government rallies continue across the nation, President William Ruto has now issued his strongest warning yet to the protesters. Ruto has vowed to crush the demonstrations, as he warned that he would remain firm in protecting the country from plunging into anarchy. Ruto was visibly frustrated when he was delivering his remarks at a church service on Sunday. Ruto termed the wave of anti-government protests as anonymous, faceless, formless, and sponsored by people who he says seek to use violence to control the nation. While he urged the protesters to not hit the streets, he assured the public that his administration would protect their lives and property against those propagating violence. Ruto's remarks come as young protesters in Kenya have planned another round of protests on Tuesday. They are planning new protests following President Ruto's announcement of a partial new cabinet on Friday. In a televised address, Ruto announced 11 appointments, which included 6 from the previous cabinet. Ruto reappointed the ministers of Interior, Defense, Environment and Lands, while he changed the portfolios of 2 other ministers.
I have started the process of forming a new broad-based cabinet to assist in driving the urgently needed and irreversible transformation of our country. I nominate the following first batch of 11 individuals for consideration and approval by the National Assembly for appointment as cabinet secretaries. and Attorney General.
Ruto had fired the entire cabinet last week, listening to the demands of the protesters. However, the protesters remain disappointed as most of the ministers have been retained in the new cabinet. They are now preparing to shut down activities in various towns and key locations in the capital Nairobi on Tuesday. Meanwhile, Ruto is urging for a dialogue with protesters. He has extended an open invitation to everyone, encouraging the Gen Z protesters to voice their concerns. However, the protesters do not agree to attend the talks, and the opposition leaders are insisting that justice is a prerequisite for any talks with the government after the deadly clashes. At least 50 have been killed and over 400 injured in the protests that started last month. The youth-led rallies initially started against the now scrapped proposed new tax hikes, but have now turned to a broader campaign against the Ruto-led government. Protesters are now demanding Ruto to step down while calling for an end to corruption and poor governance. Ruto's efforts to quell the anger against him have not worked in his favor, and now it seems the president is completely losing grip. The Gen Z protesters are not ready to bring an end to their movement until all of their demands are met. The test remains for Ruto to navigate the toughest challenge that he is facing in his tenure. From the anti-government protests in Kenya to the anti-government protests in neighboring Uganda. Here too, protesters are planning to hit the streets on Tuesday. And just like Kenya, the president here has warned of strong repercussions if the planned protests do take place. Well, the planned protests in Uganda are somewhat inspired by those of neighboring Kenya. Young Ugandans have been coordinating the protests on social media. They have been organizing an anti-corruption march to the parliament on Tuesday. However, Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, has warned protesters that they will be playing with fire if they go ahead with the plan. In a televised address, Museveni warned that the protests would not be tolerated. Not just this, but the president also accused some of the protest organizers of always working with foreigners to cause chaos in Uganda. A similar accusation has also been made by Kenyan President Ruto for the unrest unfolding in his country. Earlier, Ugandan police had informed organizers it would not permit the planned protest in Kampala, as authorities had intelligence that some elements were trying to take advantage of the demonstration to cause unrest. Who are these elements has not been made public, but despite this, the protesters say they will press on with the rallies, citing their constitutional right. Now, the protesters are furious over corruption in the country. Uganda ranks 141 on the list of 180 countries by the NGO Transparency International for Corruption. The index puts the least corrupt nation at the top. Some of the government officials, including Parliament Speaker, have faced foreign sanctions due to corruption allegations. Meanwhile, Uganda's opposition leader, Bobi Wine, has said that heavily armed security forces seized his party headquarters and arrested several leaders ahead of the protests. The police have not confirmed the claims. Uganda's president has been accused of maintaining an iron fist grip on the country since 1986. He has been accused for frequently launching crackdown on the opposition leaders. While the protesters are ready to take on the president, these protests in East Africa could perhaps be leading to a wider pattern. As youth-led rallies are now crossing boundaries, inspiring more young people, the rallies in Kenya have already become an example of how authorities could bow down to the pressure of Gen Z. But as resentment continues, it is to be seen if these rallies bring a positive change or more chaos to the region. And finally, to our special segment, Resurgent Africa. Amid the coups and the crises, there are many positive stories from Africa that often get overlooked, but not on this show. Our story today is from West Africa. Ivory Coast has declared war on one of its biggest enemies, malaria. The mosquito-borne disease is the #1 killer of children in the country. But Ivory Coast says this must end now. The nation has ushered a new era in malaria control with a new 3-dose vaccine. The World Health Organization says this vaccine would guarantee that children in Ivory Coast reach adulthood in good health. Our final report gets you the details about this ambitious immunization program.
Malaria, a disease that kills over 500,000 people every year and mostly targets toddlers and pregnant women. It's one of Africa's top killers. The mosquito-borne infection has especially threatened the West African nation of Ivory Coast for decades. It's the leading cause of death of children in the country, and Ivory Coast has been failing to fight the deadly scourge. But the battle against the old enemy has finally taken the right turn. Last week, babies in the Abidjan city began receiving the R21 malaria vaccine, as Ivory Coast became the first country to deploy the immunization.
It's really important for the children, for their health especially. This is why we came here this morning to vaccinate our children.
The shot has been developed by the world's largest vaccine maker, the Serum Institute of India, and the University of Oxford in England. The 3-dose vaccine was authorized by the World Health Organization last October. The Oxford University says that the vaccine has efficacy levels of around 75 to 80% in young children, and it costs less than $4 per dose, making it realistic to roll out tens of millions of shots. Meanwhile, the Serum Institute says it has already made 25 million doses for now and plans to make at least 100 million every year. Now, Ivory Coast aims to vaccinate around 250,000 children who are under the age of 2.
This decision shows the engagement of the government, who make it a point of honor to invest in the health of our children, our most precious treasures. We want to assure their protection and their well-being, because they are the future of our country.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization believes that the vaccine against malaria would guarantee that children in the West African nation will reach adulthood in good health.
Vaccine will guarantee without any doubt that our children will survive not just past their first birthday, but will from now on reach adulthood in good health, thanks to this innovative intervention against malaria in Ivory Coast.
Grâce à cette intervention innovante dans la lutte contre le paludisme en Côte d'Ivoire.
The Ivory Coast is not the only country to roll out the R21 vaccine. In a historic move, South Sudan also began the immunization campaign with the same vaccine last week. The country's health ministry says that the R21 vaccine will reduce the devastating burden of malaria and save countless young lives in South Sudan. Meanwhile, Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic have all authorized the vaccine as well. The R21 vaccine will be given alongside the RTSS vaccine that is already being used in countries like Ghana, Kenya and Malawi to cover 2 million children over a 4-year pilot program. The United Nations says the RTSS vaccine has already reduced the mortality rate by 13%. Malaria is one of the most neglected diseases that is preventable and curable. The African continent bears 95% of malaria deaths annually, and children under the age of 5 account for at least 80% of all malaria deaths across Africa. In the next 6 years, the World Health Organization aims to reduce these deaths by 90% in 35 African countries. And now, with the efficient malaria vaccine, alongside other prevention strategies like mosquito nets, WHO's ambitious goal that once drew skepticism suddenly looks more achievable.
And that's it on the show. We will see you again tomorrow at the same time. Thank you for watching and goodbye.